This is your opportunity to tell us about your community.
As much input as we gave, it felt like there was a lack of transparency.
When the state's Redistricting Commission missed its deadline to redraw congressional and legislative maps, members were on the hot seat.
While the homework was turned in late, it was completed.
The state Supreme Court has accepted the tardy assignment. But now, all eyes are on Seattle, which has seen a population boom, especially downtown.
That district geographically will need to shrink.
Who's making the decisions to redraw Seattle City Council districts?
Give us your maps. Show us what you want.
And what are the political implications for changing those district boundaries?
We're growing fast.
Our studio panel weighs in.
Political representation is being determined by those numbers.
Allow for communities of color to elect someone that represents them.
Shifting Seattle's political borders for better representation. Next on City Inside Out. Welcome to this edition of City Inside Out. I'm your host, Brian Callanan. Seattle's boom and growth over the past decade has affected everything from our transportation system to our housing market, and it may soon change who represents you in local politics. Based on new census data, Seattle will be redrawing the borders of the 7 city council districts authorized by voters back in 2013. The goal is to create sections of the city with roughly similar populations to ensure equitable political representation. But after a recent controversy with the state's Redistricting Commission, many people are keeping a close eye on the city's process as Seattle resets its political boundaries for the first time. It may come as no surprise. Seattle's population has grown 21% in the last decade, with much of that expansion right downtown.
This is the geographical center of Seattle.
Rick Grossman has lived downtown for the past 7 years.
This is alive.
He's one of 55 families who are members of the Cascade Pea Patch Community Garden. And he's feeling the pressure from a South Lake Union neighborhood that's more than doubled in size since 2010.
I just can't see this as at the edge of a neighborhood. This is the neighborhood.
But the political future of this area is now in the hands of the Seattle Redistricting Commission, with help from city demographer Diane Canzoneri.
There has been a tremendous amount of growth in Council District 7.
Canzoneri is analyzing data from the last census to help guide the effort to redraw the city council district lines voters approved in 2013 in order to retain an equitable system of government representation.
It's extremely important for communities of interest, including different communities of color.
The redistricting rules say the difference between the largest and smallest district can be no more than 1% of the entire population. Based on the 2020 census figures, that amount should be about 7,400 people. But District 7, which includes downtown, has grown 42% since 2010 and has nearly 12,000 more residents than what the maximum size a district should be.
That district geographically will need to shrink.
But shrinking one district means other districts will be affected too, like Districts 2 and 3, home to Seattle's Chinatown ID neighborhood.
This is a once-in-a-decade opportunity for us to ensure, again, that voters are choosing their representatives and not the other way around.
Joseph Shoji Lachman is a policy analyst for the Asian Counseling and Referral Service, which joined forces with the group Redistricting Justice for Washington to ensure communities of color have a political voice.
While the homework was turned in late, it was completed.
Lachman has raised concerns about the recently missed deadline to submit new district boundaries by the state's Redistricting Commission.
As much input as we gave, it felt like there was a lack of transparency.
The state Supreme Court has now approved the state commission's map of new legislative and congressional district lines. But Lachman wants to make sure the city learns some lessons on this process, especially from its Asian community.
We're not a monolith.
Seattle's Asian population, which grew an astonishing 455% over the past 10 years in South Lake Union alone, encompasses multiple socioeconomic groups, and Lachman says the city should recognize all of them.
I hope that sort of the future of looking at Asian American and Pacific Islander communities can be done in a very data-driven way.
Give us your maps. Show us what you want.
Seattle Redistricting Commissioner E.J. Juárez says he's looking for as much input as possible.
We are approaching this as something that we're building from the ground up.
The process does not take into account where the city's current council members live. And Juárez says Seattle's uneven growth will likely mean changing borders for multiple districts.
There's not a value judgment on that. It is, we have incredible growth in South Lake Union, in District 7, in areas of the city that are not equitable to where, if we're looking at like a West Seattle or even North Seattle.
One major next step for the commission involves hiring a district master who will create a new map by March of next year, which will kick off 8 months' worth of public outreach citywide.
This is the process in which we get to say our communities are moving in different ways, and these are how we want to move as a set of neighborhoods together.
Growth. It's something Seattleites like Rick Grossman know all about. Now the challenge is how to manage that growth with new political boundaries and an eye on the city's future.
I hope that the redistricting tries not just to represent neighborhood, but build neighborhoods.
And joining us to talk a little bit more about this very important topic, we have with us Margot Spindola. She is the Puget Sound Region Community Organizer for the Latino Community Fund. Great to have you with us, Margot. Also, we have Kamau Chege. He is director of the Washington Community Alliance, a nonprofit that works with communities of color statewide. And we also have Patience Malaba. She is a commissioner with the Seattle Redistricting Commission. She's also the director of government relations and policy at the Housing Development Consortium. Great to have all of you here. And Patience, I'm just going to dive in first with you here. Seattle voters approved city council districts in 2013. We had our first election with this new system in 2017, and now it's the first time we've had to redraw these district boundaries. So to some people, this might just seem like lines on a map, but those borders can have some major impacts when it comes to local political representation. So I want to know a little bit more about the goal of your work, why you think it's important, and what role you're going to be playing in the redistricting process.
Well, thank you, Brian. I have the honor of serving on this first Seattle Redistricting Commission, which is both exciting and an immense responsibility. And I will say that this is a process that we undertake every 10 years that profoundly on its own determines the value of people's voices in democracy. And at the same time, it is very much invisible. And my goals being on the Planning Commission is to make sure that this is a process that people like me, people from my communities understand and can engage in. Because by drawing voting districts, we set boundaries that will influence elections over the next 10 years. So this is fundamentally a process that is at the core of the idea of representation in politics, and how we draw those lines determines who gets to vote in a district. It determines who in turn gets to become a candidate and is able to win. It determines who is able to decide to step up in our own communities and represent the issues that matter most to us. And in turn, that also determines what policies are passed and how we get to spend funding in our own jurisdictions. My goal is to ensure that this is an equitable process that results in fair and accurate representation. My other two important goals that I will mention and close here is to ensure that this is a robust and effective, engaged process for people in our communities, for everyone, but more importantly, for people who have historically not been at the table to be engaged as those decisions have been made. This is a process that is so important, but in many cases, people do not understand or see it happening within their own communities. Now, our goal this time around is to make sure with this first redistricting commission that we're really engaging people across the city, but especially those voices or those communities of interest that have not been at the table. And the last and most important goal for me is that we create a simplified set of tools that enables people to understand the process from a simple, basic point where you don't have to spend time digging deep into the data, but you can simply go with the material that we provide and understand what the intent of the work is and have the ability and capacity to be engaged.
Okay. Thank you for breaking all that down with us, Patience. I appreciate it. Kamau, let me go to you here. What impact is the Washington Community Alliance hoping to have on this process in Seattle? How will you be involved?
For the Washington Community Alliance, this is a very important time because it's the culmination of the census count that we got this year, that I think a lot of people worked hard to make sure we had an accurate count of who is in our democracy. So then commissioners like Malaba and others have the ability to work with the most accurate data. This last year, Washington Community Alliance was very pivotal in ensuring that Washington went from being among the bottom 30 states in census self-participation, giving their information voluntarily and therefore providing the most accurate information about their households, to leading the country with the second highest census response. And it's already led to some of the things that Commissioner Malaba just talked about, where resources like infrastructure are being allocated by those census counts. But now through the redistricting process, political representation is being determined by those numbers. And in particular, we're really focused on the ways in which communities of color have historically been disenfranchised. So we have a state where communities of color are 37% of the population, and in only 1 out of the 10 congressional districts do communities of color compose a majority of the district. And in just 4 of the legislative districts, the old legislative districts, do communities of color comprise a majority. So obviously that's not representative, and there's some deeper structural issues. But the most important thing that we could do is make sure our members, organizations, and tribes have the information they need to make the best case for their communities and what's best for their communities in terms of representation and voting rights.
Great. Thank you for breaking that down too. And Margot, let me bring you in here. This whole idea that Kamau is talking about, communities of color and making sure they're involved, I know it's a big part of your work too. Are you concerned with this redistricting process in Seattle? We're going to see a splitting up of those communities of color in Seattle, or what part of this process are you hoping to call attention to and really pay attention to yourself?
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, so I mean, we've been a part of this work at the statewide level as well, but in particular, Redistricting Justice for Washington and other communities have been speaking a lot in regards to Seattle about the Chinatown International District that's been split and how that will impact the voting dilution of those communities. So it's really important, just going back to what Commissioner Patience has talked about in terms of engaging these communities, because we've seen time and time and again these same community members testifying and those needs not being paid attention to. So it's crucial that the local redistricting commissions listen to communities' testimony, listen to what's happening at the ground level, because they know they're going to know what's best.
Okay, great. Before we dive into a little bit more of the redrawing of political boundaries in Seattle, I want to talk about a little bit more about some of these county and state processes that are going on right now too when it comes to redistricting. And Kamau, I'll start with you here. The State Redistricting Commission, a lot of headlines on this. They actually missed a deadline a few weeks ago. Their map came in late. Soon after that, though, it was approved by the state Supreme Court. Some thoughts about what happened there and maybe some lessons that Seattle can draw from that state process.
Yeah, I think a lot of people were very disappointed in the state's bipartisan redistricting commission, which is really different from what Seattle has, which is a nonpartisan commission of community members. At the state level, what happens is the leaders of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party in each of the caucuses in the legislature selected a commissioner. And we ended up with actually 3 out of the 4 commissioners having previously been members of the legislature themselves. And in the state, there's really nothing, in state law, there's nothing around incumbency protection or any of those things. But we know that that is what happened when, mostly all legislators were kept inside their districts, and sometimes that prevented communities from being together. So for example, in Bellevue, that city, even though it's one of the state's largest majority minority city, it was split 3 different ways, mainly to protect incumbents. And in the Yakima Valley, it was even more egregious because communities of color were split. And a study from the UCLA Voting Rights Project found that the maps that the commissioners voted after their deadline were likely to violate the voting rights of Latinos in the Yakima Valley. What Seattle and the county have done really well is not make some of those mistakes, especially when it comes to transparency. Okay. So we've gotten to see commissioners discuss the maps in public. They've released them ahead of time. So the commissioners, when they voted supposedly on what they first called a redistricting framework and then later called a redistricting plan, even the chair of the commission never saw the maps until a day after the deadline when they were uploaded to the site. And what I'm especially proud of is right now, people who live in King County can comment and share their input about the King County redistricting maps that have been proposed. So a really big difference in terms of community engagement, transparency, and respecting the voters of our state.
Sure. Thank you for breaking that down. And Margot, a few more of your thoughts on this, because I know that you had a lot of focus on the Yakima Valley, as Kamau was talking about there, the legislative districts 13, 14, 15. Were these the areas that were one of the main points of contention on the state process? Tell us what you know about that, and then maybe some lessons you can think of with regard to what Seattle can learn from all this.
Sure, absolutely. So in 2011, when they created the maps, the Yakima Nation was split. And so now the commission was able to rectify that wrong and create a district where the Yakima Nation could vote as one, group in one particular district. But the gap is they created now the 14th and the 15th, but separate Latinos and the Yakima Nation from being able to vote as a cohesive political unit, which they've been proven to vote similarly, especially for Latino candidates. And so, as Kamau had mentioned, UCLA voting rights experts have already proven to show that the commission's map, by the slimmest of margins, yes, creates a majority Latino district by 0.02%, but it just does not satisfy the requirements for the district to perform for Latinos and to be able to elect a candidate of their choice. And so what's really going to be crucial for local redistricting commissions across the state is to, one, adhere to the Voting Rights Act, two, allow for communities of color to elect someone that represents them. We live in a democracy, and if proportional representation isn't at the heart of what we're working for, then we're not really truly a democracy. So really hope that they take point on that.
Okay, thank you for that. Patience, you've heard a few different things said here. I want to talk about the state process. How do you avoid that delay that the state ended up going through a few weeks ago in Seattle here? And also, how do you avoid the city's process from becoming politically divisive, which was definitely happening in the state effort as well? Some thoughts about this.
Yeah, and really appreciate thoughts from Kamau and Margot. And in terms of what we learned from that is to proactively set a timeline that gets us to a place where we're meeting the requirements well ahead of time. And what we've done so far as a commission is to set a deadline that is before the state deadline. So in putting out an RFP for the district master, we are committing to get our final draft plan by October 31st in 2022 to be done by that date, so that by November 15th, we're ready to go and sending it really forward with complete work and negotiations done. So we're hoping that that lesson of just being proactive in the data that we need to have on time, in the work that we need to do to meet the timelines is going to be important. Then other pieces that I'm taking away here is the community engagement piece that I think Margot spoke to on engaging especially BIPOC communities and making sure their voices are being listened to. With the Yakima Valley case, I think a lot of that was just not paying attention to some of the issues that the community had strongly and clearly articulated as an issue. And alongside that, it's also working closely with the legal team to really make sure that we are upholding the VRA and making sure we don't end up in a place where Section 2 is being invoked and people are being divided as communities in terms of their voice or being diluted overall.
I see. Okay. And Patience, maybe I can stick with you as we get into some of the details here, because we've been talking a lot about uneven growth in Seattle over the past decade here. District 7 in particular includes downtown all the way up to Magnolia as it stands right now, has grown by 42% over the last decade, far more than any other district. So that district has to shrink somehow, but that's going to affect other districts, of course, too. I think about this historic split of the Chinatown ID. Margot brought this up between districts 2 and 3 for the city council districts. Do you try to reunite that neighborhood, or what are some of the possibilities here? Let's talk about it.
Yeah, really great question. I mean, we're growing fast, and we're growing more diverse. I think it's important to underpin that. And then, of course, looking at District 7, which I have lived in over the past 5 years and now have moved to District 5, District 7 is going to have to shrink. But the complexity is going to be how we shrink District 7 while we grow District 2 and grow District 1 as well. There is some boundaries there that need to be considered in terms of who takes on some of that growth, because some of the boundary adjacency is going to be what is a challenge. But I think it's important as we do so to maintain the power for communities of color who are in those communities to be able to keep their voices together and have the voting power of determining who they get to be able to elect.
Okay. Margot, I'll go back to you here. It has been interesting to see this growth of different communities of color here in Seattle, but that really hasn't been completely even either. Overall, our city is now more than 40% people of color. We've definitely seen that. But I'm looking at the South Lake Union area in particular, a 455% growth in the Asian population there, 135% growth in the Hispanic population, 69% growth in the Black population. What do those numbers say to you about growing diversity in Seattle, where that growth has been concentrated, and how that's going to impact the redistricting process?
Well, that's hard to say, but I know that it'll be important to keep, first and foremost, communities of interest together, right? So if we're looking at, like you say, South Lake Union, if we're looking at even South Seattle, even in King County, we've been working a lot within the King County districting process and how we're looking at combining Darien and Tukwila and those communities and people, that's what people have been saying. So it's just, crucial to keep communities of color together and as we look at political representation.
Kamau, let me ask you a question about this, just diving into these numbers a little more deeply. You can see that the Central District increased its population by nearly a third over the last census period here. More white people moving in, more Asian people too, but nearly 20% of the Black population left. What do those numbers say to you? How does that inform the conversation over city council districts from your perspective?
Echoing what some of the folks on here have shared, what it tells me is commissioners are going to have to be really intentional, look to experts, and make sure that they're paying close attention and complying with the Voting Rights Act. I think what's different about this redistricting is it looks like District 3 didn't change quite enough to really need to change drastically in population, which means balancing out District 2 and paying close attention and being intentional. Those communities in South Seattle and the Central District is going to be critical, especially when we have a history of redlining and disenfranchisement in those communities. And especially when commissioners are able to have public forums where those ideas and voices can be heard and taken seriously, that makes for a much better process than what we saw at the state level, where we had unprecedented community input only to lead to commissioners very likely violating open meetings laws by not actually discussing these tough issues and the give and take that's necessary in public view. Because what that does is, really start questioning the trust of that voters have in the process. And what Seattle has an opportunity to do is to get ahead of that and make sure that they're having genuine conversations where people's testimony is being taken seriously.
Got it. I want to sneak a quick question to you, Patience, just because you've worked so much with the Housing Development Consortium, and ask how the commission might be looking at future growth in Seattle. Housing costs went up 25%, more than that this past year, a new record. Overall, those prices up nearly 70% since 2016. What impact does that have on the city's growth? Do you have to factor that into your redistricting process? If you could touch on that briefly, please.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the reasons I was interested in serving in the Redistricting Commission was just the recognition that how we have our communities districts drawn has an influence on what gets to be done by who is elected in those positions of power. And that's an area that we share as the Housing Development Consortium, recognizing that the cost of living has continued to grow. So the percentage of folks that you reference in District 3 that have had to leave the community are just the manifestation of the continued displacement, the continued gentrification that we see in our communities, and the continued increase in the cost of housing. These are pressing needs that remain unaddressed. They've been addressed to a certain extent. The city has done some extensive work in moving forward policy solutions, but we need to continue to have bolder policy action that moves us to a place where we'll continue to meet the need, especially of people who have been here in our communities for so long and just do not get enough support to be able to stay in community as our growth continues to grow and our economy also continues to grow.
Thank you. I need to do the 30-second version here to wrap up. We've had a great conversation, but Kamau, some final thoughts here. Your expectations for the redistricting process, top points you want to make sure the commission focuses on. I can give you 30 seconds.
Thanks so much. I think, I'll leave some of the legal action and questions to Margot to answer. What I can share is this is also one of the greatest times for our democracy, and we're seeing some of our institutions buckle under the weight of ratcheting of polarization. And now's the time to consider solutions like proportional representation, multi-member districts, that make sure that when we're doing redistricting, we're not taking into consideration politics or partisan gain, that we already have a proportional system at the foundation of our democracy. So then these sorts of issues around where boundaries are drawn do not have nearly the level of stakes and partisanship and polarization that they do right now. One of our projects, Washington for Equitable Representation, is working on exactly that, and I would encourage people to consider some of those solutions.
Thank you. Margot, some final thoughts here, main issues you want to make sure the commission is keeping in mind as this process goes forward. 30 seconds, please.
Sure. Well, in terms of the statewide commission, we'll be waiting to hear their next steps. I know the Supreme Court has now ceded their authority over these maps. We are hoping for a public feedback process of some sort, but people can definitely weigh in via, opinion editorials, making sure they're staying in the loop with our coalition, Redistricting Justice for Washington, and, submitting some sort of court opinion to the courts as well. We will be filing suits. So making sure the public stays informed and educated on this issue is going to be very crucial so that the people that are held accountable are indeed held accountable.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Patience, just a final thought here. You've taken in a lot of feedback today. I know you're going to be choosing a lot of things over the next couple months. Got a district master coming on in the spring. Tell us what the public can expect to see in the next year out of the redistricting process. Can give you 30 seconds, please.
Well, we are committed as a commission to move forward a transparent process, a process that will engage folks and get us to a place where we are inclusive and we have equitable outcomes at the end. This, to me, is an opportunity. It's a once-in-a-decade opportunity that we have to empower communities, all of our communities, but more importantly, the communities that have not been at the table for so long. And this is our chance to do that together, united and not divided.
All right. Thank you very much for your input here, and we will be right back. What are people saying on social media about redistricting Seattle? One writes, it is crucial for the public to be vocal in the redistricting process to ensure that maps are drawn to serve our communities and not the interests of politicians. Another comments, census data shows that the heaviest concentrations of people experiencing homelessness are Pioneer Square, downtown, and SoDo. We'd like to know what you think. Send us an email at contact@seattlechannel.org or find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Coming up next week, it's time to wrap up 2021 with our panel of journalists. What were some of the best and worst political headlines? We'll get the scoop on the next City Inside Out. I hope you join us.